Good day and greetings. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the proposed Lava Ridge Wind Project located in south central Idaho, north of the Minidoka National Historic Site, a unit of the National Park System. I'd like to thank Kimi Kumar and the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for the opportunity to share with you how best to provide public comment during the National Environmental Policy Act EI Environmental Impact Statement process. But first, I'd like to acknowledge I'm speaking to you today from the Washington, D.C. area, which is the ancestral homeland of the Anacostan and Piscataway peoples. I also want to acknowledge the fact that Minidoka War Relocation Center was built on the ancestral and ceded lands of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. One point of terminology when I talk about Japanese Americans who were sent to Minidoka during World War II, it includes Japanese Alaskans. These are folks that were that have shared Japanese and Alaska Native ancestry. Before I start, I also want to just mention that we have a second presentation today at 7 Pacific, 5 Mountain, 7 Eastern, 5 Mountain, and 4 Pacific, and that today's session will be recorded, both this session and the evening session as well, and the chat will be recorded as well. So most people, I'm sure, on this call have heard of the Lava Ridge Wind Project. We recently learned about it through the Bureau of Land Management scoping process, and we were caught by surprise. And fortunately, though, we asked the Bureau of Land Management to provide an extension of the public comment period, and they recently agreed this week to extend the public comment period by an additional 30 days. So the public comment period runs through October 20. I'm working with the Friends of Minidoka and the Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee to ensure that all parties, including survivors of Minidoka, their descendants, members of the Japanese American community, and our partners will have an opportunity for their voices to be heard and their stories told. We're very fortunate to have to be able to partner with two leading conservation organizations, the Idaho Conservation League and the National Parks Conservation Association. They are planning to provide information about how best to comment during the scoping period and as the Bureau of Land Management continues in the environmental impact statement process. With that, I'd like to just start out talk a little bit about myself, my family background, and the monument. So my family, my dad and my grandparents and my uncles were living before World War II in Eatonville, Washington. They worked at a sawmill, Eatonville Lumber Company, in the shadow of Mount Rainier. This is a picture of my dad and my uncles arriving at Minidoka via train from the Puyallup Fairgrounds Camp Harmony. This is a picture of my family, my extended family in camp, and my grandparents are in the middle. My grandfather, Chet, my grandmother, Agnes. My great-grandmother, Misa, is on the far right. She was Issei. She was married to one of the founders of the Japanese Baptist Church in Seattle. My dad and his brothers are in the middle, and my great-uncles, 3 great-uncles, are there as well. The reason that they're dressed up in camp is the fact that they had all, the 4 Japanese American brothers, my grandfather and 3 of his brothers, had enlisted in the Army on the same day. Fortunately, my family was not separated. My grandfather was able to stay with the family until he left camp to serve in the Army in stateside. Next slide, please. So this slide is an excellent graphic that is derived from the Densho new Sites of Shame website. And what you're seeing here is on the yellow, or the orange rather, is folks being relocated primarily from Seattle, Portland area, some Los Angeles, as well as Alaska. Unfortunately, I didn't capture them on the map. Being sent to Minidoka there in Idaho. And then as the war was winding down, folks were able to leave camp. And you can see the diaspora, the people, the families represented with the blue lines, like my family moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin after the war. They never did go back to Seattle and stayed in the Midwest. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk about Minidoka itself as a National Historic Site and relate it via maps with the proposed LS Power wind project. So the map that you're looking at shows the National Park Unit, Minidoka National Historic Site. It's roughly 500 acres, and it consists of primarily the administrative part of the camp. There's some barracks. You can see Barracks Block 22, the reconstructed Barracks Block 22 on the east side of the park. The new visitor center, you can see there a little bit close to Barracks Block 22. And off to the left or the west side, you can see kind of a little squiggly shaped property coming out to the west, right near the camp entrance, the site of the guard tower. That squiggly property was owned by a private landowner. And about 10 years or so ago, the LS Power Company, a private equity firm out of New York, proposed building a high voltage power line right over that property, known as the Robeson property, which would have significantly damaged the park and the visitor experience. Fortunately, then Secretary Salazar directed that the power line, it's called the SWIP line, Southwest Intertie Project, be relocated west of the park. The reason I mention that is because that SWIP line is now what would provide the transmission to connect the Lava Ridge Wind project to the broader electrical grid. You can see that the camp was actually much bigger than the park. There's barracks, sites of barracks blocks that are currently not protected. They're in private ownership off to the north and to the east of Minidoka. Next slide, please. So this is a blow up of Jerry Arai's historic map of Minidoka. And what it shows, you can see the barracks on the left, on the west side, the park, and the camp was self-sufficient, or worked to be self-sufficient through agriculture, through irrigated agriculture. You can see that outside the barracks or outside the fence line, there was quite a bit of camp infrastructure, farms, and other livestock operations that was outside the fence line, but within the historic footprint of the camp. Next slide. So the next slide here shows right in the middle there, you can see the barracks blocks and some of the agriculture fields. And this larger footprint encompasses about 33,000 acres. And when people talk about the proposed LS Power wind project within the footprint of Minidoka, it's within this larger footprint. So going on maybe to the next slide, please. So this shows the larger proposal. If you look sort of down near the bottom, it says Minidoka National Historic Site, that little sort of triangle box there. That is within 2 miles. You can see how large this is and how it would really dominate the landscape and the viewshed from the park as you look to the north and to the east of the National Historic Site. Next slide. So I want to spend a little bit of time here to talk about the National Park Service, the mission of the Minidoka National Historic Site. The National Park Service issued what's called a foundation document, and the foundation document is actually derived from the Park Service's general management plan. So after the monument was established by a presidential proclamation in 2001, then Superintendent Neil King worked with folks in the American community, stakeholders in Idaho, to put together the general management plan. And that plan was based on what extensive input from the community, both the Japanese American community as well as the local community in Idaho. And they put together in the general management plan what are called fundamental resources and values. And the National Park Service is required by statute to manage those fundamental resources and values unimpaired for future generations. Those fundamental resources and values came from input from the Japanese American community. So this is your story. These are what you wanted to see the park managed for. Next slide. So in terms of fundamental resources and values, this is what the Park Service, the Japanese American community recommended, and the Park Service included in its management plan. So number one is environmental setting. Sorry that this is so hard to read, but it talks about the immersive setting that is fundamental to the visitor experience. And this includes views of open fields and distant mountains create a sense of isolation on a vast landscape. Experiencing the environmental setting allows visitors to better understand and connect to the daily lives. So this is a really important thing. And as you develop your comments or you think about drafting comments, think about your visits to the park and think about standing at the fire station or overlooking the baseball field and looking out to the north to the Pioneer Range and thinking about that immersive experience and the ability to feel or understand, the isolation that folks in camp felt. It's an incredibly powerful landscape, and this is something that's very important for the park. The next item that the park, the foundation document talks about is commemoration and healing. And Minidoka provides places for engagement, reflection, and healing. In terms of commemorative events, I think back to my grandparents who were in camp. And I think about the importance of this camp. I'm disappointed that they unfortunately passed away before the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 or the tremendous work around camp preservation. But think about people in your family or people that you knew that you wanted to commemorate their memory and how important this site is to commemorate. The other thing I'd highlight is everyone associated with a camp has experienced deep pain. The impact of losing your communities, your house, your business, your family broken up. It's been a terrible emotional hardship from the camp, as well as the shame over the last almost 75, 80 years of feeling like you are the enemy or feeling like you did something wrong. But thankfully, the National Park Service is doing a great job managing Minidoka as a place for healing. So if you're comfortable talking about that pain that you've experienced, as well as the healing at, say, an annual pilgrimage or trip to the park, that would be a really important point to include in telling your story. The third thing is public understanding, education, and involvement. When the Park Service reached out to the Japanese American community, it heard a very clear message that we want this site to be part of the educational fabric of the United States. By acknowledging the terrible decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans, this is an important site of conscience. It's an important place for people to learn, whether through field trips, virtual field trips, in-person trips, or through combination with local schools or colleges and universities, or even online digital resources like Densho. So this is what's at stake as Minidoka as an educational resource for our children and grandchildren. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ben Otto, who is an energy associate at the Idaho Conservation League, and Danny Gibson Webb, a conservation analyst also with Idaho Conservation League. Ben and Danny, thank you so much for your time. We value your expertise, and we're grateful for your ability to come here today to explain how best to participate in the process.
All right, thank you very much, Dan. I'm very pleased to be here and speaking with you, and my colleague there on the screen, Danny Gibson Webb, is as well. And we'll hear a little bit from her later in question and answers. Danny's a real expert in the wildlife impacts, but I come at this from an energy perspective. So for about the past 10 years, I've focused on causing our Idaho utilities to get out of fossil fuels and get into clean energy. And the reason we do this is to protect the climate and the quality of life we all deserve. But increasingly, we're focusing on the cultural connections to Idaho's environment, and which is exactly why I'm very excited to talk with you today. I got into this work and became a lawyer to help raise up the voices and stories of the most impacted, but least heard in society. And the most important thing I want to tell you today is that your story matters in this process, and that you all are already experts in your own experience and your personal connection to Minidoka. I hope to help you tell that story effectively so that we can influence the BLM's decision about the Lava Ridge project. So our next slide is just a little background about the Conservation League. We've been around for about 40 years. We have a staff of about 20, a little more than 20, in 3 offices across Idaho. We work across 4 big campaigns to protect salmon, to clean up the Snake River, to protect public lands and wildlife, and to address the causes and consequences of climate change. And across all this big portfolio of work, we try to follow our overall mission, which is to create a conservation community and pragmatic, enduring solutions that protect and restore the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the land and wildlife you love. The Lava Ridge proposal, which we're talking about today, is an intersection between our climate and our public lands work. And while we know that moving to clean energy is essential to protect our climate, we do this in order to protect the natural and cultural values that we all care about. And we prioritize people and the environment. So this is a really interesting project for us to be working on because of these intersections and the different values. You know, in full disclosure, I didn't know the details of the Minidoka story and the incarceration of Japanese Americans, other than the little bit they teach us in public schools. And I was a little bit embarrassed about that as I've learned more. And so I really want to thank first Holly with the National Parks Conservation Association for inviting me into this and introducing me to Dan and Kamiko and Julie. And I'm really deeply honored to be invited into this conversation and help share my expertise to help raise up your voices. So our next slide, I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the project, where we're at in the process, and then we're gonna go right into some tips based on our long experience commenting on NEPA documents or proposals like this. And we really hope that those tips will help you just be an expert in your own story and tell that in a really effective way. So this is a big proposal. Lava Ridge wind proposal will be among the largest in the West. If it is built, it's the largest in the West proposal right now. The developer chose this site because it has relatively low wildlife conflicts. At least that's it initially, it looks like. And the spot is at an intersection of a whole nest of transmission lines that allows the project to access the whole entire Western electric grid. This is a whole regional infrastructure scale project, which really raised it on our radar, as it seems maybe like an okay spot, but it's so big that the potential for conflicts is probably more than we initially realized. So now as we're diving into this, we're becoming aware of a lot more, and particularly the impacts to the Minidoka site and the story that it tells. So where we're at in the process, and the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more details, but we're really at the first step in this. This is the, you'll see here where that blue sign is that this is kind of the first step. And the goal of this step is just to fill the written record with your own stories and the impacts the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, must consider when looking at the proposal. And again, you don't need to be an expert in everything. You are already an expert in your own experience. And the goal now is just to write those down, to fill the record with your own personal stories. And we're here to help with that. We're also talking with other impacted communities like the Shoshone-Bannock, the Shoshone-Paiute, local residents, county officials, other wildlife groups. There's a lot of people looking at this project from a variety of perspectives. The next, oh, and one last thing on that, the timeline, we believe the full permitting process, so all the way down that whole long list of steps, will last well into 2022. So there'll be a lot of opportunities for you and others and the whole community to have your voices heard and to weigh in on the process. This is really just the first step. So now let's go to the next slide and look at, this is what the Bureau of Land Management, who's looking at the issues, this is the whole range of things that they will consider, that they have to consider. And we've highlighted this one box, which is about historical connections. Sorry, the screen's a little small, I didn't see that. This is where you fit in. And as you can see, these are not hierarchical. All of these considerations are equally weighted. And no one has to be an expert in all those spaces, but collectively, as all of us in the public weigh in from our various stories and our various places of expertise, we really build up a full picture of the potential impacts and what the BLM must consider. And so as you can see, this cultural values and historic values is just as important as everything else. But I want to really be clear, you all, this community, has some of the most compelling stories about how this proposal might impact the values that you hold dear. So your voice and your story is incredibly powerful in this broader topic. You know, we at ICL, we're really focusing on other areas around the impacts to wildlife and water, recreation, those types of things. But together, by each bringing in our own story, the collective is what really helps influence the BLM decision-making. So this next slide is the tips that we have. Our team at ICL, we comment on several of these proposals, NEPA documents, National Environmental Policy Act documents. We comment on several a week. And based on that, here's our best tips. The most important thing is the most basic tip is to be yourself, to speak or write. It's really important to write down your comments, to really build up the written record in this case, but speak about what you know. There's no need to be overly formal. You don't have to be an expert in anything. You just need to share your own personal connection. And Dan brought up the fundamental resources and values contained in the Minidoka Management Plan. The really best effort is to connect your experiences to one of those values and how the proposal will degrade your experience. That is the chain of logic that has the most impact at the Bureau of Land Management or to the decision maker. As you can see, some of the other tips, like I said, make it very personal. It's fine to just tell a personal story. You don't have to use fancy language, just be real. Establish your connection to the impacted area, why it's important to you when you visit it, that you'd like to visit it again, and that you expect that visit to continue to have that same experience. I really encourage you all to highlight your pilgrimage experience. It's one of the most compelling connections to the site and the potential impacts from the project that I can imagine. Your story and your connection to this space is extremely powerful. Really make a point that if you have annual visits or that you plan to visit the site in the future, that you do so with the hope of having that similar experience, experience at the site, forever, in perpetuity, for yourself, for your children, for future generations. You want to be as specific as you can. As I mentioned, trying to tie your story to the values contained in the management documents and how the project will impact those values is more effective and more impactful than just being general. And just before we went live today, we talked about developing some talking points, some tips, some more materials that we'll be able to share with you all to help make those connections between, you know, a wonky management document, but your own personal story. The last thing I want to say on this is that style matters. Remember, the BLM is responding to Magic Valley Energy's proposal. And so a friendly tone that helps the BLM decision maker understand your interests and make a connection between your values and how those might be impacted is really going to be most impactful, and it helps the agency make a decision that we like. You know, everybody likes to be treated with, you know, respect and friendliness. And right now, the agency's stuck in a hard spot. They have a proposal from a private company that's going to impact public values, and we want to really help and encourage the agency to make a decision that respects those public values. Sorry if I spoke a little quick, but that's our best writing tips. I really want to make sure that encourage people to know that this is actually pretty simple. The most important thing you can do is just share your personal story and be as effective as you can be. The last slide here is just the basics. We have until October 20th. Here's a link to the more planning documents. And here are the two ways that you could send in your comments. They're both equally valid. You could do it by email. You could do it with a you know, physical mail, but it's important to write down what you have to say. So again, thank you so much for inviting me in. You can learn a lot more about our work at theconservationleague.org. But I really want to thank Holly from the National Parks Conservation Association, who introduced me to this community. And so now we want to hear a little bit more from Holly about her work and the Conservation Association's work.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Danny, and ICL for sharing your expertise on this process. Also, thank you, Kimiko and Julie, for organizing this talk, and Dan for your decades of work on Minidoka and for sharing your story and giving a land acknowledgement. Because Dan provided the information on the fundamental resources of the park and Ben covered the process, I want to focus a little bit on Minidoka as a National Park Service site and how the National Parks Conservation Association works with communities and partner groups to ensure that these national park sites are protected. So our organization was founded a little over 100 years ago, shortly after the National Park Service itself was established, and we were created to be an independent citizen voice for the national parks. The National Park Service itself cannot advocate for parks. It cannot take position on issues. And so that's where we all come in. NPCA joins with communities and mobilizes advocates to fight for these special places. Next slide, please. So many of you expressed at the public meetings, and Dan has already talked about that these sites are not just places that they're not just lines drawn on a map. They're places with harrowing histories, and they are places that are deeply felt by the people that are connected to them. And so as you can see from these images, the top left, Manzanar, the next over Gettysburg, the bottom, Minidoka, and to the right, Chaco, that these parks aren't islands. They sit within a landscape that contributes to the story and the sense of place. And even looking at these photos, you can get a feeling for these places. You can feel the isolation at Manzanar and Minidoka and the weight of the Civil War at Gettysburg and the long history of people that came before us at Chaco. All of these sites would lose that sense of place and history if they were surrounded by development at their park borders. So the good news is that a wide variety of communities and partners have successfully protected national parks like this from development that would have had devastating impacts. In Gettysburg, efforts to build a casino just a half a mile from the battlefield were stopped, and that casino was relocated to a more appropriate location within the state. 2 industrial-sized solar projects that were going to be right next to Manzanar were put on hold indefinitely because of organizing efforts from the Manzanar community and partners. And tribal leaders and partners stopped lease sales that would have opened lands next to Chaco for oil and gas development. MPCA worked with all of these communities to stop these efforts, and we're here to support the Minidoka community and the larger Japanese American community in this project. Last slide, please. So just as Ben and Dan both have talked about, there are many people that are concerned about the impacts to Minidoka, impacts to the beautiful night sky that you can see here, impacts to the viewshed, impacts to the feeling and the importance of the site itself. And, you know, you don't have to be an expert in these comments to talk about these impacts. We're hoping that this presentation will give folks a little bit of support, but like Ben mentioned, we will provide information that will help with those comments. But this process is really supposed to be about citizen voices and not just for experts in the process. And I think you all already proved that. It was your stories and your voices during the public comments that already got the 30-day extension. So you've already done an amazing work within the NEPA process, and we're here to continue to support you in that. And so, like I said, we'll be offering that support through the Friends of Minidoka and providing that kind of format, bullets that can add to the stories in your comments. And so with that, I think we can just open it up for questions, because I think a lot of people can build off of the things Dan and Ben and Danny provided. Thank you.
Great, Holly. Thank you so much. I just want to express our appreciation to you for taking the time. This is going to be a big fight, but fortunately, the Japanese American community, the Asian American community, we're not alone. We have partners, very strong partners, NPCA, ICL, other partners. So that building those partnerships, expanding those partnerships is going to be critical for our success. Question or point I wanted to make about the scoping meetings from last week. There were 2 meetings that BLM sponsored. I know a lot of folks were involved in that. Though, if you submitted comments in the chat, or those comments will not be included in the record. So even if you expressed yourself at the scoping last week, please take the time to comment in the formal comment period, which we now have until October 20th to make those comments and submit those in writing. So that's something to consider. A point came in about the archaeology and the archaeological impact. So I don't know, Ben, if you want to speak to that question.
Just the short answer is yes, for sure. That's a key consideration for the BLM to include in their analysis. So I obviously don't know the specifics of that, but definitely that's the type of thing that you want to put into your comments. If you happen to have some expertise in a specific area, in the archaeology of the site or any other aspect of the whole range of things, was the environment, like anything that you feel like you know something about, now's the time to put it in. But it'll definitely be considered. The archaeological values of the site are a key value to be protected. Great,
thank you. Question came in about seeking experts in the Minidoka community to submit comments. Really 2 responses to that. First off, I've been involved in camp preservation for 20 years, and what's really struck me just within the last 10 or 15, 10 years has been the outstanding work of the Japanese American Confinement Sites Coalition. It started off with the All Camps expert of the All Camps program, and what I've seen is just a remarkable coming together of folks. Obviously the Minidoka story needs to be told, but the broader Japanese American community is really rallying. It really doesn't matter if you're from Heart Mountain or Amachi or wherever. We want to have the bigger footprint of people. The second part of that question seek out experts in the Japanese American community. The more the merrier, the more folks we have engaged in this process, whether it's as a survivor and a descendant of a camp, or if you have subject matter expertise. Ideal, if you know anybody Japanese American lawyers who could have some time. There's folks have expertise in other fields, maybe biology or whatever. I mean, we could definitely use all the help we can get around historic preservation. If somebody has technical expertise relating to, the impacts of wind projects on, night skies or whatever, we want to, slot people in and get them involved wherever they can add the most value.
Hey, Dan, why don't I take a second to talk a little bit about what ICL's like, kind of what we're seeing so far in commenting. So I'll say a little bit, but Danny's actually, read most of the documents. But some of the top things we look at are like dust impacts from the road building, impacts to wildlife habitats, water resources, birds and bats. And Danny, are there some other things that you've found that you're looking into?
Yeah, so of course, one of the main things is the impact to the scenic quality at places such as the Minidoka Historic Site, as well as the impact to Craters of the Moon, which is also another national park facility, and just kind of generally how these big giant structures could just impact the view, because I mean, they are so incredibly tall and just giant. So trying to see how that would affect the entire viewshed in terms of maybe seeking out like modeling of that specific impact is definitely something that I am passionate about and looking into.
Great. Thank you. In terms of the impact, I would just add, I did some calculation. The tallest of the wind tower is going to be 760 feet tall. So if you think about the guard tower at the entrance gate to the park, it's 26.5 feet. So if you take a guard tower and take 28 guard towers and stack them from the ground up, that's going to be how high one of these towers is. And there are going to be 400 of them. And Park Service shared a really outstanding letter over the weekend where they outlined the potential impacts to the park, and it equated this to basically one tower equivalent to the size of the Space Needle in Seattle, and the turbine blade is equal to the wingspan of a 747. So this would be equivalent to a 747 rotating on the top of the Space Needle, and 400 multiplied times 400. So you're going to have visual impacts, you're going to have sound potential impacts, you're going to have night sky impacts, you're going to have a whole bunch of impacts. So keep that in mind. The one thing I would also emphasize is we in the community, we don't have to be an expert on every element of this. We're fortunate to have folks like Danny and Ben and Holly who can really speak to some of these other important resources that could be negatively impacted. So a question came in about viewshed, and with a typical park unit, you will have federal land, generally a small footprint. So one of the pictures that Holly showed, I believe, was Gettysburg, and one of the most iconic viewshed in our country is at Gettysburg when you stand at a place called the Angle, which was looking across over the field to Pickett's Charge. And the field itself is owned by the National Park Service, but the viewshed in the background, what you see, that experience is really important and part of the viewshed. Another example of viewshed is at the Flight 93 Memorial in Pennsylvania, where you can look out and you can see the impact of the crash site, the final resting place for the passengers and crew of Flight 93. And in the background, the Park Service has identified, acquiring scenic easements to conserve the viewshed surrounding the crash site and the memorial. So viewshed is a really critical part of providing for the visitor experience so that people will come to parks, will want to come to parks and enjoy those parks and have the ability to appreciate what happened and to learn. So thank you for that great question.
Dan, I might add a little bit to that. Out here, for those of you who visited the site know that the view is pretty expansive. It goes a really long way because it's a relatively flat place, right? And you can see all the way to the Pioneer Mountains. You can see super far. Our understanding is that you'd be able, if you were standing at the Minidoka site, you'd be able to see basically all of these towers. They would all be in the viewshed of the Minidoka place. And so that impact extends beyond the boundaries of just the location. It's everything that, if you're standing in that boundary, everything you could see is part of the impacted place. And that's a really important concept to think about and to talk about.
Great, thanks, Ben. Just a reminder, again, we have a second session today. So if folks, if you thought this was helpful, please reach out to your contacts. It's at 7 Eastern, 5 Mountain, 4 Pacific. And like this session, it will be recorded. So feel free, if folks miss it, to send around a link. Also, I just wanted to add the Friends of Minidoka is providing regular updates in partnership with the Minidoka Pilgrimage Committee to the community on the Friends of Minidoka website, and we will provide information to you that way. We are grateful for everyone's involvement early. We had a huge win with the extension of the public comment period, and we encourage people to remain engaged, to reach out to your friends, to reach out to partners. And whether you're in Idaho or you're out in Oregon, Washington, you can make a difference and your voice needs to be heard. We're very hopeful that Secretary Holland will listen to the Japanese American community when she making a decision on this project going forward. I would also acknowledge that we in the community understand that our nation is facing and our world is facing, an existential threat from climate change, and climate change is posing has terrible impacts on communities of color and communities across the United States. So we support renewable energy. We just want it to be done in a balanced way, that public lands are managed in a balanced way, and that not one use of the public lands dominates or precludes other uses of those lands.
That was really well said, Dan. As someone who thinks every day about clean energy, that I couldn't have put it any better, so I'll just stop talking. Well said.
Same here. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you. Also, just wanted to put in a plug. There is a Tadaima session scheduled on Friday this week. It's talking about allyships. There's going to be a panel. It's going to be talking about Japanese Americans and historic preservation. And I will plan to talk about this project and allyships with folks actually with the National Parks Conservation Association relating to the proposed legislation to establish the Amachi as a National Historic Site on Friday this week.
I just saw a comment in the chat from Mary about the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. I personally, I've not been in touch with them. I know others have, and so I know I'm sure they're aware. But there's definitely could be more always to be done to raise this issue in their priority list. But
yeah.
Ben,
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Holly.
I was just saying a lot of that stuff is happening through Section 106, which is a whole other process, but a process that's running simultaneously with the process we're talking about, NEPA. And I know Dan, you are maybe much more steeped in that than the rest of us.
Well, actually, that's a really good point and question. Individuals can ask to be a consulting party in the Section 106 National Historic Preservation Act compliance process, which is a separate but concurrent process with the NEPA process. So folks can reach out to Casey Prestwich at the Bureau of Land Management, who's a project leader, and request to be added as a consulting party that enables you to receive information about the Section 106 process. There is in the chat a link to the how to email your request to be included as a consulting party, as well as to submit your comments.
Dan, while we're waiting for other comments, I might just take a second to talk about the next steps in the process a little bit. So this is really, scoping is where you gather all the information so that the BLM and who's making the decision can know what they need to look at. The next step is called the environmental impact statement, and that's where analysis of the issues that we raise, that's where that occurs. There'll be a draft, there'll be an opportunity for public comment and involvement and shaping of that analysis. That will then go into a final document where they incorporate those public comments. There'll be an opportunity after that for more public involvement and process before any decision is made. So it's kind of an iterative process. Right now, we're putting everything on the table, and then through time, we refine both the issues and what we want done with them. And so this is definitely something to be involved in over time, and know that we don't have to do everything right now. Right now, we just fill up the record, and then in later stages, we start refining that, both our comments and our impacts, to influence the decision maker. And we'll be there, the Conservation League will be there, Holly, I'm sure, with the Conservation Association will be there. So we're looking forward to more of that process, but know that we'll have a lot more opportunities as we go along.
Great, thank you so much. And if folks are able to share their comments with via the Friends of Minidoka website, that would be super helpful, so we could start collecting those comments. It will give us a much better sense of, what are some of the powerful arguments. One of the things, I know this is a very difficult topic and subject for a lot of families, a lot of people who have camp experience, but I know for my grandparents, the experience they were in camp, particularly my grandmother, who was raised 3 boys by herself, because my grandfather was in the military. It was very painful for them to talk about. It was very emotional for them to talk about. They did not talk about it. And I would encourage folks to just think about some stories so that people can understand what happened to you and your families at camp. And so people can really appreciate, people talk about the environmental impact statement. Well, I think the emotional impact statement is really important here. The depth of your feeling about this, to me, frankly, I'm angry. And I'm angry about the fact that thanks to over 20 years of investment in Minidoka, it's become an incredible place for learning, for healing, and for understanding. And then to see this proposal come up without really much notice to the community, it really, to me, creates a lot of pain and trauma, particularly against the backdrop of the violence directed against the AAPI community during COVID. So I encourage people, if you're comfortable, talk about those hard stories and how beneficial this park has been for the healing process.
If I could just build on that for a second, one of the things that's really interesting in this project is that the impacted community is not just in Idaho. It's around the country and potentially around the world. Dan shared that very interesting map of where people's connections to Minidoka and what it represents extends across the whole country. So don't think that you just have to be in Idaho or anything like that. Your connection is to the place, no matter where you are in the geography of our country. So contact your friends and family or anyone you know around the country who might be impacted by this. Your voice is just as valid as somebody who's right next door to the place. So really think broadly about your connection to the place and don't be constrained by where you happen to be. It's about your connection to where that site is.
And something that I would really like to emphasize and add is that you may feel like all you're telling is your emotions and your story, and that maybe that doesn't seem like it should be as important as like the technical analyses or the biological impacts. However, that is super important. And as we're moving forward in the conservation community and as our departments are moving forward, they're considering these social cultural values at the same level as your typical hard science values. So we can translate your stories and your emotions and your feelings to values and to things that really are substantive. And so your stories are more than just you sharing your feelings. They can really have a huge impact. So I really encourage everyone to share these impacts because it has personally affected me in the way I'm viewing all of this. And I know that it will have similar impacts to other people as well.
And just to build on all of that, we had talked about earlier too that typically the BLM does in-person meetings, and because of COVID, we had the online one. So I think suggesting in scoping comments as well that the BLM continue to provide online meetings for the expanded community that isn't just in the area and able to come to in-person meetings. So there will be other public meetings when different parts of this process open up.
Great. Thank you, Holly. So a very good question came in through the chat about the potential partnership between the Japanese American community and Native peoples, tribal nations. And we are very eager to work in close partnership with any partner, including the Shoshone-Bannock tribes of the Fort Hall Reservation, the Shoshone-Paiute tribes of the Duck Valley Reservation. As I mentioned, this is ancestral lands associated with the Northern Shoshone peoples, and we'd welcome the opportunity to work together. Unfortunately, the Japanese American community and Indigenous people have experienced firsthand racial prejudice and government policies driven by race that have been designed to suppress our voice, suppress our cultural heritage, our Japanese American heritage. We were made to feel like we were, quote, the enemy. We were encouraged to be, quote, the model minority and not to make any waves. So we look forward to the partnerships. As I mentioned at the beginning, there were Japanese Alaskans of the Issei generation Japanese immigrants married Alaska Natives, mostly in Western Alaska and interior Alaska, and they were rounded up. Those families were rounded up and sent to Minidoka, along with Japanese Americans from Southeast Alaska. So we want to ensure those stories are told. I would also flag that unfortunately, the Japanese Americans were not the only people of color community that were rounded up during the war. The U.S. government rounded up communities, Aleut people in the Pribilof Islands and the Alaska Peninsula, and they forced them to go to camps in Southeast Alaska. It was incredibly painful experience for Alaska Natives. There's actually a session is coming up on that, so we'd welcome the opportunity to work with the tribes on this project. Well, I just wanted to thank you. If there's no more questions or comments, Ben, Danny, Holly, I would thank the Idaho Conservation League, the National Parks Conservation Association for helping us better understand this process and giving us excellent advice about how we can ensure our voices are told. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the later session, and hope everyone has a great afternoon and evening, and look forward to working together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.